Rev it up and welcome to Cars Yeah, show number 2509. Today, an old friend comes back to share his new book. Burt Levy's back on Cars Yeah. Be prepared to have some fun.
This is Cars Yeah, where you'll enjoy interviews with inspiring automotive enthusiasts. Mark Green is here to provide you with a fuel injection of automotive inspiration. So get in, sit down, buckle up, and get ready for a wild ride here on Cars Yeah.
Hello, inspiring automotive enthusiasts, and welcome to Cars Yeah. Today I'm in Westchester, Illinois. I've been there before because I'm with a very special returning guest by the name of Burt Levy. Burt, welcome back to Cars Yeah. Do you have any gear, and are you ready to release the clutch?
Yes, I am. I'm revving it up. I'm glad it's not my car.
As always. Well, for you longtime listeners, if you go way back to when I started this podcast in 2014, Burt was guest number 47, but he talks a lot, so I did a two-part show with that show. So he was guest number 47 and 48, and then he came back pre-COVID in May of 2019, and he was guest number 1,291. But of course, today we're up in the 2,500s, and I'm so excited to have him back because guess what? Burt is writing another book. Is anybody surprised? If you know Burt, you won't be surprised. So Burt, one thing I didn't ask you when you were on the show before I give you a little more proper introduction, this may be a tough one, but what's one little thing that people don't know about Burt Levy?
Gosh. I took tap dancing class when I was about 8 years old.
There you go.
Seriously, I think, there's the writer and the racer in me. And the racer, of course, I'm getting to an age where I'm appreciating it almost more from the sidelines than from inside a car. But they're two completely different things. And the impetus for me starting writing the first novel was that I hated all the books that I'd read, novels that I'd read about racing. I didn't think they captured that world, particularly, the long garage nights, the long tows, the disappointments, and the humor. Mm-hmm. There's a kind of a gallows humor that hangs around racing, and it's very special. And, and I've always felt that motor racing is the only thing that even comes close to approaching it in terms of the interface between the animal part of a human being, the reflexes, the reactions, the decisions that you have to make in a split second, mm-hmm. and the technical side of a human being to design and build and adjust. The only thing that's even close to it is World War II, mechanical military combat, particularly the air war. And that's really special. I mean, there is no other area of human endeavor that gives you that mix.
I think I agree with you. And having been a vintage racer, and we're going to be talking about Lotus today, and my first race car was a Lotus, I understand fully. Yeah, it is a special thing. And the people, to me, it's all about the people. So Let me give you a little more proper introduction. We're going to dive into what you're up to here. Burt B.S. Levy is known as the world's fastest novelist. He's been racing and writing about racing for more than a half a century. He and I are up there in age. He won something like 100 amateur and vintage races and 8 season championships in a truly incredible variety of cars. Burt's served as a track driving instructor for clubs and race-sanctioned bodies and has been a special events and banquet speaker numerous times. I'm not sure we could even count them all. No doubt, if you are a true automotive enthusiast, your library shelf has at least one of Burt's books on it. More likely, like mine, it has many. Burt's best known for his historically accurate and utterly hilarious The Last Open Road series of motorsports novels, plus a radio play period-correct version featuring many famous voices. And guess what? Including yours truly. Today, Burt will share his latest book titled A Lotus, a Love Affair. We'll be back in just a moment to talk a lot about Burt and Lotus and everything's racing. But first, a word from our sponsors. So give them a little love. Buckle up. We're with Burt Levy today. We'll be right back. 20, 50, or 100 years from now, will there be a workforce to care for the collector vehicles we love? With auto shop programs disappearing across the country, it's a question we enthusiasts have to ask. That's why I support the RPM Foundation, which exists to ensure that the critical skills necessary to preserve and restore these vehicles aren't lost to time. One of the many ways RPM, which is short for Restoration, preservation, and mentorship, is accomplishing this goal is through workforce development initiatives. The RPM apprenticeship program enables the next generation of artisans to earn a living while they learn the craft of restoring and preserving these vehicles directly from industry professionals. The Endangered Skills Program documents the process of masters training future craftspeople on a variety of critical skills in danger of being lost forever. For more information on how the RPM Foundation is driving the future of the collector vehicle skills trade, visit RPM Foundation today. They're one of the charities of choice here on Cars Yeah! For several years now, you've heard me talk about Linkage Magazine. I've been a subscriber since the start. Their talented and creative team brings you a spectacular publication and website that shares the automotive passion from a worldwide perspective. Linkage is about driving, restoring, collecting, and first-hand experience at collector car auctions and more. They bring you real-world values plus rational, experienced opinions on the current markets. They cover the automotive world and the people who share our passions. And Linkage Magazine has grown, mailing you 6 issues annually. Join me on this journey with Linkage. They're geared for the automotive life. You can subscribe at linkagemag.com. So, Burt, I want to go back in time just a little bit before we dive into Lotus and this new book, because for anybody listening, and I doubt there is anybody listening that doesn't know a lot about you, because you've just been in the racing world, especially the historic racing world, for so long. I want to go back to the beginning, to the last open road, because my understanding is it's now in its 12th hardcover printing, over 50,000 copies sold. And you touched on it before we started talking a little bit about why you've gotten into this, but could you kind of go through a shortened version, if you will, of that book and all the books that you've written up to this date that will get us up to the current book? So take it away, my friend.
Well, first of all, I've never done a shortened version of anything in my entire life.
I know, but I'm trying to set the tone here so we don't do another 2-part, 3-hour show.
Let me give it a shot.
Okay, you go for it.
Essentially, I started racing back in the very early 70s and did fairly well at it at a real Bush League level, but realized pretty quickly that I didn't really have the money to go much further than SCCA National, and even that was a stretch. And then I discovered I'd done some writing in high school and college, and when I dropped out and bummed around the country, I did some writing. And I wrote an article that Auto Week bought about an old Corvair we had. The TR3 first, and then a Corvair. And then I got an opportunity to write an article for Joe Marchetti, who was a restaurateur in Chicago, but started the big July vintage race at Road America. And he wanted an article about a driver's eye view of Road America. And I knew the track well. I'd actually won there and set a lap record the previous year. So I wrote the story, and instead of writing me a check, which Joe hated to do, he bought and sold Ferraris and Exotica on the side. And he put me in a Ferrari short wheelbase Berlinetta to drive at Road Atlanta, a real alloy car.
Wow.
I mean, I can't even imagine what they're worth today. And I drove it and wrote a story about it that I sold to Auto Week. And another Ferrari owner offered me a drive to do a story. And then Joe let me co-drive his 250 LM at Road America the following July. And I wrote a story about that for Vintage Motorsport. And it dawned on me, hey, this is a great deal. I'm getting to drive the cars that I really love from the era I really love. And they're not mine, and I'm not paying for it. And this beats the heck out of, browsing through my checking account to see if I can afford new tires for my Alpha race car.
Yep.
So I started driving other people's cars in return for writing stories about them for the magazines. And, I mean, this is a good deal.
Yeah.
So I was actually driving an Alpha Spider that was originally built by Horst Queck that I found in a barn, literally, and that Joe essentially became my partner in. He put up the money. I built the car. I was going to race it. And then when we sold it, whenever that happened, we were going to split everything over his original investment. And it seemed like a great deal. So I think we ran 15 races in that car, and I won 13 of them. But again, that was the early days of vintage racing. Mm-hmm. when most of the drivers, not all, but most of them, were collectors that thought, oh, I want to take a shot at this and see what it's like. So they weren't very experienced at that point. And I had a lot of experience by that point. So we did really well. And I went down to the Bahamas Vintage Grand Prix in 1986. The car had the name of Joe's event on the side. He was sponsoring me for the race. And I was sitting around the pool at the hotel early in the morning with a wicked rum hangover. And I had a little Radio Shack computer, and I'd been thinking about doing a novel about car racing set back in the 50s, early 50s, which is an era I love. And I started writing it right there at poolside.
And that was the beginning. That was the beginning
That
of the
was
last
the
open
beginning.
road. Wow.
Yep, 1986 in Grand Bahama Island. Oh, I can't remember the name of the motel. It was owned by Howard Hughes, but I think it was about to be sold out of bankruptcy or something. Mm-hmm. Bottom line is, I would work on the book during the winter, and then racing season would come, and I'd go chase race drives and cover events for the magazine, and kind of put the novel up on a shelf. And then come fall, late fall, I'd take it down and start working on it again. And each time I did, I'd say, it's been a while. Maybe I should go back to the beginning and bring myself up to speed. So for the first 5 years, I rewrote the first 200 pages 5 times.
Oh, my gosh.
And
wow.
it finally dawned on me, Burt, you got to get to the end once.
Yes.
And then you can go back. And I finally got it done. It took me 8 years. And I thought it was really, really good. But I think everything I do is really, really good. And the experience shows that that's not always true. And I had no agent. I had no experience in the publishing world, but I thought, oh, this is so good. They're just going to love this. So I sent it off, no agent, just in an envelope, major fiction publisher in New York, because that's where they all are. And it took a while, but the rejection letters started coming in. And one after another, they came. And finally, there was only one publisher I hadn't heard back from, and I think it was HarperCollins, but I'm not positive. Mm-hmm. And finally, it had been so long, I called, and of course, you wind up in phone limbo. In those days. You'd call and you'd get leave a message, and you'd leave a message and never hear anything. So finally, one Friday, I remember this. I called, and somebody answers. It's this lady. And she was obviously expecting a call from somebody else, not, from me.
You accidentally picked up the phone.
Yeah, she accidentally picked up the phone. And she was impatient in the way that only New Yorkers can be, and dismissive. And I said, I sent this manuscript in the last open road, and I was just wondering, I'm like a little kid digging his toe in the sand.
Sure.
And she says, last open road, oh, I remember that. That's a good story. Very good story, but we can't publish it. Why not? Well, those people don't read.
Those people.
Those people.
Yeah.
And I thought, I know there are words I cannot use on your podcast, but I thought, blank you. Mm-hmm. I got so angry.
Yeah.
Because, New York is not a car town.
No.
At its core. I mean, there's some wonderful events there. There's some wonderful enthusiasts there. My friend Murray Smith used to put on that Vuitton Concours at Rockefeller Center, which is spectacular. But I thought to myself, I'll show you. As a matter of fact, that was my entire business plan. I'll show you.
There you go.
So I went to my wife and I said, honey, she said these people don't read, but I don't think that's true. I think she's thinking of, drag racers, oval track racers. She doesn't understand that road racing people, not to disparage roundy rounds or drag racers, but they tend to have more higher education, maybe a little more aware of the classical arts, maybe. So I thought we had a market, particularly among vintage racers. And I said, we're going to publish this ourselves. And my lovely wife of now 50 years.
Congratulations.
Yeah, you should congratulate her. She's the one who's put up with all the you-know-what.
Yep. I've got one of those in my house, too.
My wife said, with what? And I said, I think we can sell this. So we formed a company, and God bless her, she backed me up. We took out a second mortgage on our house and published it ourselves. I got the books in late July and went up to Road America literally with a trunk full of books and no clue as to how I was going to go about selling them.
Now, what year was this, Burt?
This would have been July of 1994.
94. Well, you know what? I'm going to jump in just for a second here because
Go ahead.
I think that is when I met you. I think.
Very likely.
Because I'm pretty
You
sure
were with
I was there
Richard?
for the we were at the Can-Am races and had some Can-Am cars there and open wheel cars. I believe that's when we met.
Well, there's a funny part of the story. I figured that we needed some kind of publicity because nobody had heard of me or the books or anything. So I made up these posters, and the poster had a picture of the cover. That's a whole other story where that picture came from. And I made up reviews. You know, I laughed my ass off, Yasser Arafat, which, you know, he was still alive then, so it was funny. And quotes from the one review that a friend of mine had done from the manuscript, and then some other stuff that I just made up. And they were printed on 8.5 by 11 sheets on a crappy printer. And my wife, I was actually driving for Joe that weekend. So before I went out, I handed my wife and my son, who had to be 40, had to be, what, about 16 then? I'll figure it out. I said, put these where everybody will see them. So I went out and I did my practice session and schmoozed around for the story I had to write for the magazine. I hadn't seen any of the posters. And then I had to go to the little boys' room. So I go in one of the porta potties, and sitting right over the urinal is my poster.
Hey, there you go.
My wife and son had put them over every urinal and inside every porta potty on the premises. And you know how big a track Road America is.
Oh, yeah, it's huge.
And we became famous over time for our potty posters. And I actually got one of the first mainstream stories, not car magazine stories, written about us, was about the potty poster as a way of course, now it's gotten to the point where everybody's putting up posters in the Johns. And,
Sure.
You know, it's like that old Yogi Berra quote. Nobody goes there anymore. It's too crowded.
It's too crowded, yeah.
So anyhow, that's how it got started.
It's amazing. In fact, when I was at Carrillo's Garage, we had a catalog business. We sold your books in one of our Christmas catalogs, and we never did well selling books. It was always a tough one for us. And this was, of course, way back pre-Amazon or very early Amazon days. But we did sell some of your books, and that was a nice little test. But, as I said, Burt can talk for a long time, and I want to get into, and since then you've done how many novels?
Well, there's currently 7 novels in the series.
Yeah.
Amazon's got them all. They're all on Kindle. You can get them from our website, lastopenroad.com.
There you go.
If you want a signed copy or personalized copy. And you'll see the Last Open Road decals on race cars everywhere,
Yep.
particularly at Road America, but all over the country. And unfortunately, book publishing is a crappy business. That's why so many publishers have consolidated or gone out of business, because you're not dealing with a high-ticket item, but it's a bulky item, and you've got to work with distributors if you want to have bookstore distribution. And we have a very good distributor now, but you got to give them 50% off. They hold back money for 90 days in case they have returns. If there are returns, you got to pay freight both ways. Oh, and they pay in 120 days.
Yeah, it's terrible.
So it's a wonderful, wonderful business for somebody else to be in.
Exactly. Well, I want to dive into the new book because Lotus, as I mentioned earlier, Lotus and I have a nice relationship because when I got into vintage racing, my first car was a Lotus 18. And, that was my first experience with doing anything so-called racing. It was vintage racing, raced at Road America, mostly out here on the West Coast. But the Lotus mark has something special, or holds a special place in your heart. And I'm wondering, to start this off, because I always like to talk about an inspiration or mentor. What is it about Lotus that inspires you?
Well, when we had our shop, when we first got married, I was going to be a professional racing driver. I was absolutely certain of that. And I thought, what we really need is our own sports car shop to have a base of operations. So when Carol and I got married on Valentine's Day, 1974, which was also her birthday,
Nice.
we'd already planned. I said, this is what we're going to do. And like an idiot, she said yes and has been saying yes all along. And when we came back from our honeymoon, we'd already made a deal on the shop we were going to open, Mellow Motors at 747 Wrightwood in Chicago. And I have never done less racing than when we had our car shop.
Of course.
But a lot of the stories that wound up in my books came out of those experiences at the shop and at the racetrack. At any rate, I was fascinated by Lotus as the very first race car garage I was ever in my life. There was a XKSS Jag in a million pieces. There was a Morgan. And there was this guy, he's passed away now, who became a really good friend, Ed Tillotson. And he had a Lotus Cortina, which he always referred to as my Lotus. And I thought that was cool. And then he wound up working at the sports car store, which was a Lotus dealership not far from us. And I would go there and hang out. And that was the period when the Europa big valve, you know, the pretty JPS one.
Oh, yes.
Black with the gold stripes.
Yeah.
He had two of them on the floor. I thought, oh, man, that is the coolest car I've ever seen. Then as time evolved and I started driving other people's cars, I not only wound up getting a lot of rides in Lotuses, but had extremely good luck with them. I went to the Pittsburgh Vintage Grand Prix, which is a phenomenal event. And my good friend J.R. Mitchell from GMT Racing in Connecticut, I'm sure you've seen him at the vintage races.
Oh, of course.
He takes care of a lot of cars and does a fabulous job. And he's a good driver and a great guy. And he had a very early Lotus 7 with a Coventry Climax FW engine in it. And he said, do you want to drive it for the weekend? Oh, yeah. And I had a pretty good reputation for not hurting other people's cars. And I'd never been to Pittsburgh before. It's a fabulous, evocative racetrack that reminds me of the era I write about in the early 50s when they ran on open roads, when they didn't have purpose-built racetracks. Very dangerous, but wonderful. And in the group they put me in, small bore sports cars, it was, in my opinion, by far the best car. And I wound up winning the race. Yeah, that was, and it, you know, it says in the last open road, one of the characters asks, what's a good driver? And the answer is, a good driver is a guy who can win when he has the best car. And what's a great driver? A great driver is one that can win when some other guy's got the best car.
Yeah.
So I had the best car, I won. Then I drove a Lotus 18, Dick Baker's car. I raced it for him twice and just fell in love with it. And you'll concur with this. I've driven a lot of cars. I mean, from pre-war Austin 7 specials that scared the crap out of me to the Can-Am Shadow that won the 1974 Can-Am Championship.
Oh, there's a scary car.
And had 948 horsepower and something like 1,500 pounds. That was exciting.
Yeah.
And I've driven Ford GT40s and Mark IIs and the original Chaparral, the original Scarab. Of all the cars I've ever driven, the Lotus 18 has got the best steering feel of any car I've ever driven. And part of that is down to the geometry of the suspension, but also the skinny tires.
Oh, yeah.
I think that, you know, as you get bigger, fatter, stickier tires, the steering gets heavier, and you're always trying to find that spot between stick and scrub.
Yeah.
Yeah, and scrub, where you're actually, you know, if you don't see modern race cars getting sideways hardly at all. And that's because when they get sideways, they lose speed rather than gain it. Back in the day of the Lotus 18 and the Lotus 11 and all those cars that I love, you could slide the car and actually go faster by doing that rather than slowing the car down. The car was much freer in those days, and I love that.
Yeah, I loved racing that car too. It was fun. I never felt very safe in it because you had no
You
protection. No
You
protection.
shouldn't.
Yeah, but I guess it was a good car for me to start in then, right? I didn't know it at the time.
Yeah, probably Miata would have been safer, but they didn't have them then.
Yeah.
There's actually a section in the new book where I talk about the almost motorcycle-like sense of omnipotence and control you get in an open wheeler, and balancing that against the vulnerability compared to a fendered car. But anyhow, to get back to the original thrust of this, I got to drive a whole bunch of different Lotuses and won quite a few races. I got to co-drive the late David Whiteside's Lotus 17 in the Rolex Vintage Endurance Championship, and we wound up winning the championship in 1994. We won at Sebring, Road Atlanta, Mid-Ohio, second at Roebling. It's all in the book. But at any rate, I drove the Lotus X180R for Yesteryear Motorsports several times. And that car was the last factory Lotus sports car to ever win a professional championship with Doc Bundy and the Bridgestone Supercar Series.
Wow.
So I had, and I've driven thanks to Wire Wheel in Florida, Hayes Harris's business. I've driven a Exige Turbo, and I instruct for the Lotus clubs. So I've driven a lot of Elises and 211 and all that kind of stuff. So at any rate, I was working on a second short story book, another Podside Companion, almost done with it. And I said, you should do a chapter about all the different Lotus cars that you've raced, wrecked, tried to fix, all the great stories and horror stories that always go hand in hand with Lotus cars. Mm-hmm. And I started working on this quote chapter, unquote. And then when it got up to about 60,000 words, it slowly dawned on me.
It became a book.
Yeah, this is its own book. So I threw the rest of it together, and we put out a preview edition, a softback black and white that you have a copy of.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And I'm working on the hardback, which will debut, knock wood, cross fingers, in time for Christmas. We've already got about 280 orders for it. And this is my first coffee table book where I've got historic images from my racing history. It's really going to be, God willing, a handsome book and entertaining to read.
Well, of course, as all your books are. You talk about photos and things, and I wanted to touch on a challenge. Books are a challenge anyway, but one of the things that I learned about this book is that sourcing and properly crediting all the photos in graphics has been a challenge. And I've had hundreds and hundreds of authors on the show. In fact, categorically, that's probably one of the biggest categories here at Cars Yeah of the over 2,500 shows now. Can you talk a little bit about why that's a challenge and how you overcome that?
Well, I haven't overcome it all the way yet, but here's the deal. Obviously, each time I would do a magazine story, I'm not a very good shooter. I'm really not. And if I was covering an event and also driving in that event, there's no way I could be out on the corners shooting pictures of the event I was covering. So I became used to working with photographers, and I work with some wonderful, wonderful, wonderful photographers. Top on my list was always Art Eastman, who was also my editor at Vintage Motorsport for a while. Brilliant graphics guy, great, dedicated, extremely technically aware photographer. He actually did the covers for many of my books. Unfortunately, he passed away not long ago, but he was just great to work with. And because of him, I became aware of the photographers that don't get credited, where they'll see their shot in the magazine and there's no byline on it, there's no check in the mail on it, and they're rightfully miffed. I mean, this is how they make their living, or part of their living.
Right.
So there were a bunch of images in the preview edition that you've got, which, by the way, we're not selling at retail for this very reason. There are a bunch of images I clipped off the internet to use, historic images. Then I had images that I mostly knew where they came from my own racing history and Lotuses. And just 2 days ago, after a lot of back and forth, I'm going to be getting help from William Taylor. He's the archivist for Classic Team Lotus.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, in England. And they, of course, it's Colin Chapman's son, and they field and prepare classic Lotus race cars, some for owners, some essentially rented out, but at a very, very high level, like at Monaco and places like that.
Mm-hmm.
And we made a deal for them to supply me images, some of which have never been seen before. I'm a little bit close with Dan Gurney's widow, or Evie, and Kathy Weta, who worked there for many years, now retired.
Oh, yeah, I know Kathy. Yeah.
And there's a long section in the book about Dan Gurney, who I just think the world of. And I had written a section in the new book about Dan, not just about how good he was, but the schedule. He was a tall guy.
Mm-hmm.
And he was crisscrossing the Atlantic back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, I'm sure on just regular commercial flights. During the 62 season, he's running it, or 63, he's running at Indianapolis with the Ford program that he was actually the instigator of. He had paid out of his own pocket to bring Colin Chapman to Indianapolis so he could see what was there. And of course, Colin famously said, build a decent chassis and put a decent motor in it, and you've beaten these great old hunks of junk. And sure enough, it took several years, but that's what happened. So I wrote that in the new book, and I sent them a copy of it, and they've been kind enough to dig up some archival photos of Dan in those cars for me to use. I've got a deal working with the Revs Institute in Naples, Florida, and also the Barber Museum, which actually has now some of the Lotuses I drove that used to be in my late friend David Whiteside's collection.
Oh, wow.
So all of a sudden, and I mean all of a sudden, I've got the assistance that I need to make sure that I can properly source and credit the historic photos that we're going to be using. I'm also beating the bushes for the shooters of some of the other shots I've got where, I remember the weekend, and I remember the drive in the car, but I'm damned if I can remember who the guy was taking the pictures.
Yeah.
But, I'll do the best I can.
Yeah, it's all we can do. There's a great picture by Jesse Alexander of Dan Gurney in Monaco at the start, and I believe he's in a Porsche Formula One car, and his head is so far above the roll bar that you just kind of go, man, keep the right side down. But
Wait, can I say one more thing about Dan Gurney?
Yes,
because you mentioned him in the Porsche. He's such a fascinating guy. And what a talent. He was the only driver that Jim Clark's father told him at Jim's funeral, you're the only other driver that he was worried about in terms of skill and ability. And Dan had drove for Ferrari. He was there when Phil Hill was there and Richie Genter, I think. No, it was before Richie. And at the time, Ferrari was the top team. Hawthorne won the championship in 58. Mm-hmm. But Dan didn't like the Machiavellian politics and the way Ferrari maneuvered his drivers and workers kind of against each other. And he quit Ferrari when they're at the top of their game, and he went with BRM. And BRM built their first rear-engine car, and of course, one of its famous features was a single rear disc brake on the back of the transaxle. And whether that was the culprit or not, he lost his brakes at Zandvoort, went off at the first corner, and killed, I think it was one or two young guys that were in a place where they shouldn't have been. Mm. And that scene, or that concept, was lifted in the movie Grand Prix when I think it's Sarti goes off and kills two boys who are where they shouldn't be on a racetrack. So Dan left BRM and went to Porsche, and their Grand Prix car was never quite up to the others. It was air-cooled. It was a little bit pudgy looking because of the layout. But he won the only Grand Prix race that Porsche ever won, which I think was at Rouen. It was the French Grand Prix. I think it was at Rouen that year. Mm-hmm. And he damn near won the Nürburgring. He put that heap on the pole. And it was a terrible rainy race. And there was him, Surtees, and was it Graham Hill or Jim Clark? I forget. They're running nose to tail in the rain around this 14-mile circuit that is just twisty and tortuous. And Dan probably would have won it, but he had the battery come loose in the footwell. And he literally was holding the battery
Oh my gosh.
against the frame with his left ankle while he's driving
Jeez.
in a rainstorm. And he still finished. You could have thrown a blanket over the three cars at the end. They finished third. But what a brilliant driver.
Yeah.
And,
And a wonderful guy too. Just,
and an American.
yeah.
You know, what an American. He's everything that an American hero should be.
Yeah, you know, and
I'm done.
he was working right up to the end. I was conversing with Kathy, his assistant, over and over again to get him on this show before we lost him. And every time she said he'd love to do it, but he's trying to get this book done. He's trying to get this project done. He doesn't have too many days left, and we lost him before I got him on here. I was lucky enough to meet him several times and got to sit with him for a few moments at least on one of his books, and he signed it for me. Mm-hmm.
Can I tell a side story that's in the new book?
Mm-hmm.
I was flattered to be he and his wife, avid readers, and I had published The Last Open Road and done my best to promote it, but I was still completely unknown. And then I got a call from Phil Hill, of all people, who I'd never met. And at first I said, yeah, right, sure, this is Phil. And someone had given him a copy, and he wanted to buy a case of the books to give as Christmas presents. And I'm falling all over myself. I want to give him the case of books free, you know. And he says, no. I'm happy to pay for it. I think he may have been the one that gave a book to Dan and Evie Gurney.
Oh, wow.
And I'm in my office, and I remember it was like late winter, like February. And we're not selling a lot of books, and I'm kind of in the doldrums. And out of nowhere, I get a letter on AAR Stationery, and they didn't know me from Adam. And it was just a 2-line letter from Dan saying how much he and his wife enjoyed the book.
Wow.
And how well it captured that era. And boy, it was just the boost I needed.
No kidding.
And so, that story, along with a copy of the letter, is in the new Lotus book in the section about Dan.
Nice. I love it.
And we went out to see him, me and John Morton, and Greg Elliff, who restored his old Indy cars. And Dan was walking with a cane then. I was after his motorcycle wreck, and we got shown around and got to see the room with the famous champagne bottle from Le Mans, where he squirted the crowd for the first time. And we got around to talking about the BLAT, that's the boundary layer air technology. They built this car, the Pepsi Challenger Indy car, that was basically an upside-down F-16 wing on a car. And ground effects was starting to be well known, but this is a really, really well-done champ car edition of that. And he was also typical Dan. He didn't want an Offie. They used a stock block Chevrolet, which in those days was allowed to run at a larger displacement than the Offies and the Fords were already there. And so we're sitting having coffee and donuts, and I'm going to be the big know-it-all writer. I said, yeah, I know that was a great car, but it only won one race at Milwaukee, and that's probably because of the superior throttle response of the naturally aspirated Chevy V8. And Dan looked at me, big smile. He says, well, Burt, you can keep drinking that Kool-Aid if you want to, but if you want the real story, and then he told me the real story of that car and all the places it had led and run away from everything else, and was obviously going to be the car, the combination that you had to have. And there was a groundswell of opinion, understandable among all the other car owners, because they were realizing that everything that they had in their garage, not only were they going to have to buy new cars, but everything that they had in their garage was going to be junk. Yeah. And so the BLAT car and the Chevy stock block at that size were both outlawed. And, like the Jim Hall sucker car, the 2J. Yeah, it was revolutionary. Yeah, it was unbelievably fast. But if you leave it in, it's going to ruin everything for everybody else. And nobody wants to see one car run away. You want to see competition.
Right. Yep, I understand. So I'm going to crawl into your head and be a bit of a car psychologist with you a little bit. This could be a scary place,
Uh-oh.
but we're going to try. If you were a Lotus, now this isn't what kind of Lotus you want to be, Burt. This is you looking in the mirror, digging deep into your mind, into your heart, into your soul. If you could pick one Lotus that best describes you, what would it be and why?
Oh, I think it has to be the 17 that David and I won the Rolex championship in for a very good reason. When it was originally designed, and, this is going to be a long story that you're going to have to edit. When Chapman built the 11, it was a watershed car. He put the Coventry Climax FW in it, and it very quickly became the car to beat in 1100cc and 1500cc club racing. And at that time, before the advent of Formula Junior, that was the, if you will, the nursery class for anybody that had aspirations, particularly in England, of going anywhere in motor racing as a professional driver. And the 11 reigned for, three and a half years as the car to beat. And there was good competition from Cooper and Alva, but they just weren't on the 11's performance plane. Plus, Chapman had put together Team Lotus, basically professional drivers, even though they're young guys trying to make a name for themselves, as opposed to like Alva was just selling cars to people that wanted to race them. And so Chapman not only had a design advantage, he had probably a talent advantage behind the wheel. But at any rate, they're mopping up. And then this guy named Eric Broadley that nobody ever heard of decided to build a car to run with the Climax FW. And that would be like stepping into the ring with Muhammad Ali when you'd had one amateur fight or no amateur fights. Mm-hmm. But the car he designed, the Lola Mark I, was slightly smaller, slightly more aerodynamic, definitely better handling, and arguably more beautiful than the Lotus 11, and proved very quickly that it was the better race car. As soon as Eric Broadley got out of it, and they put a professional grade driver in it. So Chapman realized, and by this point in life, Chapman's got a toe in the water in Formula One. They're building road Lotus 7s, and he's trying to keep his business afloat and advance in all the series he's in. But he's got to answer this challenge from the Lola Mark I. So they have a car already on the drawing board, the 17, which is designed to win the Index of Performance at Le Mans. And they're going to run it with this little tiny 750cc Climax engine. It's like 7/8 the size of a Lotus 11, which is already a small car. The way it's originally drawn up, it is Chapman strut suspension front and rear. It worked good in the rear, but in the front, well, let me put it this way. Chapman decides, okay, we'll put the 1100 in it, let it go race against the Lola because it's smaller and lighter and should be quicker. They go to their first race weekend, and I think the driver was Alan Stacey. Might have been Peter. No, I think it was Alan Stacey. He practices the car, puts in a great front row lap time, and refuses to race it because the handling is so unpredictable.
Oh.
In the fullness of time, with some testing, they come to realize that the strut-type front suspension, think of one half of a motorcycle front fork. Mm-hmm. The front suspension, as it goes through its travel, the forces are making it bend slightly, and so it binds up. And, of course, when it binds up, the steering goes solid, and the car skips up and skates. But as soon as the load is off, it goes back to being fine again. So completely unpredictable, very hard to track down and diagnose. They finally figure it out. And by this time, Chapman has sold several Lotus 17s to, Lotus buyers who've had an 11. Oh, this is his next car. I want one of these. He did something he'd never done before or since. He offered a free kit that's free to update the Lotus 17 to a dual A-arm front suspension like the Series 211s had. And that made it quite a bit better. But it still wasn't as good a car or as comfortable a car as the Lola Mark 1. And it's interesting because the 17 was the last front-engine Lotus sports racer ever built. The 18, the car you had and that I drove in Savannah, was the first rear-engine, Lotus design. Mm-hmm. So at any rate, bottom line is that the car didn't do jack what back in the day. It was not a winning car. And so now we fast forward to my era and vintage racing in early 1990s. And I had just driven a Lola Mark 1 and written a story about it for British Car Magazine. Good story, too. And I love the car. And I get a letter on very nice stationery out of nowhere. Would you like to sample Colin Chapman's answer to the Lola Mark 1? Sure as hell I would. So we make a date, and I meet the owner, David Whiteside, who became a very, very dear friend. I can't say enough about the times that we spent and the things we discussed and our perceptions of the world. But at any rate, I drove the 17 at Watkins Glen and did well enough in it that he said, well, do you want to co-drive the Enduro? And thus began, a 3.5-year deal where we campaigned that car in vintage Enduros, and it coincided with HSR starting the Rolex Vintage Endurance Championship that we ran together and did really, really well. So I love the irony that here's this car that was an outcast, an unsuccessful car in its day, and yet in modern vintage racing, it's never about how fast you are. It's always about who they put you in against. Mm-hmm. And he had the 1460 FWB motor, which was more powerful, and it was a great car. We won at Sebring, rode Atlanta, Mid Ohio twice, Roebling Road, where else? Second at Watkins Glen. It was a great car, and we did really well with it. So that's got to be the one that I like because it's such a star-crossed story. And, it's the warts and the glitches and the terrible experiences that really make the character of a car, that and the people that you meet that come with it. So that's the one I feel most affinity for.
Nice answer to that question. Again, the new book coming out is A Lifelong Lotus Love Affair by the great Burt Levy. And you said this book should be or will be available by Christmas?
Yeah, you can order it on the website.
Okay. What is the website?
lastopenroad.com.
There you go.
And we have a deal where if you order the deluxe edition, which comes in a fancy sleeve with a little cloisonne emblem that one of my artist friends came up with. It's like a heart with a Lotus badge on it, but it's done in kind of dark, somber colors against a kind of a crushed black velvet background. It's neat.
Nice.
At any rate, if you get the deluxe edition, we throw in free for nothing one of the preview editions so you can start reading right away while I'm trying to finish the other one up.
There you go. Well, again, listeners, what I would encourage you to do is order a pre-edition of this book so when it comes out, you got it. Or better yet, do like Phil Hill did. Buy a whole case and give them out to your friends. That's the way to do it.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. And in the meantime, go to lastopenroad.com. And if you don't have any of Burt's books, which I'll bet you do, but if you don't have them all like I do, they're all available. You can get them. Just go to his website, or also available on Amazon, you said?
Yes. The new book is not available on Amazon yet. That won't come until after the first of the year because I'm greedy and I want to get all the people that want it for Christmas have to buy through me and get autographed copies.
There you go.
And I'd like to give one more quick plug. We did an audio book of The Last Open Road that is really pretty unique.
Oh, yeah.
I rewrote the first book as a 1950s radio play with different character voices, music, sound effects. I budgeted $15,000 in a year to do it. It took 3 years and cost me $100,000.
Yeah, it's amazing, by the way.
We hired professional voice actors to do the main parts. And then we got mystery celebrity guest voices, including David Hobbs, Brian Redmond, Tommy Kendall, Patrick Long, Ray Evernham, Bill Warner from the Amelia Island Concours, John Morton, P.D. Cunningham, Spence Pumpelly, you.
Yep.
We got all these people that are known in the motorsports world to do cameo appearances. And I was honest about it. I said, the only reason I want you in it is because I know you like the books. It will enhance our marketing ability by saying that you're in it. And we don't tell you which part they play. You got to figure that out.
Yeah.
And one day maybe we'll have a contest about it.
Yeah. I think it's a cool thing.
I finished it just in time for the COVID pandemic to hit, which was terrible timing. And we had it available as CD sets or USB flash drive. It's now available for download from Amazon, Audible as well, and anybody else that carries it. It's won a couple of awards. It's the perfect companion for a long drive to your next race event, or if you're towing a race car. It's 19 hours long, and I guarantee you will be entertained.
I guarantee it too, and I was so honored to be asked to be a little piece of that, so thank you for doing that for me. Burt, as always, it is a joy to chat with you. I want to thank you for coming back and being one of the very rare 4-timers here on Cars Yeah. Thanks for being so generous with your time. Thanks for providing all of us who love the sport with so many great stories.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Until you and I talk again, I'll see you down. I usually say I'll see you down the road. I'll see you down the last open road. How's that?
Sounds good.
All
Thank
right.
you so much, Mark.
It's been great fun. You're welcome.
Thank you so much for joining us on today's ride here at Cars Yeah. Drive on over to carsyeah.com to find show notes and inspiring automotive fun. Download your free copy of Filler Up, a fun book filled with gorgeous photographs of fuel filler fun, including quotes from more inspiring automotive enthusiasts. Download your copy today, and we'll see you next time on Cars Yeah.